morning. Glad to see so many of you actually being up and awake. So I'm going to present this paper called Pass the Ball and Force Turn-Taking in Activity Tracking. This is work done by John Rooksby, myself, Mattias, Rost, Alistair, Morrison, and Mattias Chalmers, and we're all from University of Glasgow. So I'm not going to talk so much about games, although I will be presenting a game, but I will mostly be talking about activity tracking. So a lot of people in this room probably are in some way doing activity tracking already. Some people might have some kind of physical device on their wrist looking at how much they're walking and stuff. But you might also be running something on your mobile phone, like an app that tracks your activity in certain ways. But even if you're not aware of it, if you have a modern mobile phone, it's already doing activity tracking for you. It's counting your steps and how much you're sitting and when you're in a car or whatever. In this work, we're kind of looking at activity tracking slightly different from something that's just kind of passively being done as you kind of walk around or doing stuff. Instead, we're looking at what if you require a social interaction before you can actually do any tracking. So there's, of course, been a lot of work in this area already. And a lot of this work kind of deals with how can you motivate physical activity. How can you get people to do maybe more or to maintain a active lifestyle, perhaps to fight obesity or whatever. And they do that in kind of different ways. One way is to kind of add some kind of game mechanic to the activity tracker and reward physical activity by giving badges or things like that. But also a lot of social features involved with these trackers that allow you to kind of connect with other people, share your physical activity with others, and doing things together with people. And also many of these kind of commercial activity trackers do the kind of the same thing. They track your activity, they say how many steps you're taking, or they say how much you're running, how long you're running, how fast you're running, whatever. And then they allow you to kind of share that with your friends on social networks and things like that. But what all of these things do and have in common is that they do this tracking as just something that they do. And then they build these other features on top of that. So tracking is kind of, it's quantifying your activity somehow, giving you a measure of that, allowing you to see that, and then it has some kind of mechanics on top of it. What we are doing in this work, and with Pass the Ball, we're kind of reversing that relationship. We're saying that you need to have some kind of social interaction, you need to socialize with other people, and when you do that, that's when you can enable the tracking. So the tracking is not there in the start. So we're not dealing with behavior change and not trying to kind of build a system that motivates people to move more, that a lot of these systems do. But we do use some concepts, and especially two of them that we'll talk briefly about, to analyze kind of the work with Pass the Ball. And so the concepts are competence and social relatedness. So competence kind of deals with your ability to understand your activities and the ability to kind of measure and quantify what it is you're doing, and then in order for you to understand how you can change that behavior, to change it into something desirable, perhaps achieve a goal. And social relatedness then is the ability for you to kind of connect with and be understanding of and be respected by others, feeling kind of that other people are supporting you in this thing. And so activity trackers often do this thing in different ways. The activity tracker with the tracking part kind of supports the competence part, and the social features typically support the social relatedness part of that. And again, then with Pass the Ball, we are reversing this relationship. So enough with the background. I know I need to actually talk about what I'm actually going to talk about. So what is Pass the Ball? Pass the Ball is a mobile game, runs on Android and iOS. It's a team-based game where each team has a ball, and the ball can be carried by one team member at a time. And when a person has the ball, and when the ball is active, as we say, your activity is being tracked. And the activity here is being tracked by using the accelerometer in the phone to kind of look at, how vigorously are you moving about. If you go running, you get more points, and if you're, walking, you get less points. If you're sitting still, you don't get any points at all. And we're kind of being a little bit ambiguous what that point is. You can compare it to kind of a Nike fuel band you use kind of score instead of using steps, for instance. So, and when you have this ball and when you're kind of being tracked, you're only being tracked for 1 hour at a time. After that, the ball becomes passive, you're no longer being tracked. And what you have to do is you have to pass the ball, hence the name of the game. So you have to pass the ball to some other person. And so what happens is that it kind of becomes a coordination problem to decide how should you pass the ball, who should get the ball next. Or if I'm about to do some activity, how should I make sure that I get the ball so that I can score for my team? We also have this concept of interception, so you can intercept the ball if the ball becomes passive or if someone doesn't receive it when it's being passed. And that's kind of to just make sure there's not a stalemate in the game. Someone has the ball and they lose interest in the game. We also have in-app communication, so they can talk in the app and write comments to each other. And the teams compete in a weekly league. So this is kind of a screenshot from the game. There are notifications, just to kind of, if the ball is being passed to you, you get a notification of it. You don't have to go into the app to check for that. In the middle here, maybe is the most important point, is where you kind of see your own activity or someone else in your teams, or even someone else's in another team's activity. So here you kind of have my activity between 4:25 and 5:25. The red bars here denote kind of how vigorously I was moving, or how vigorous the phone was moving. And then how many points I got for that activity, and that was 3,375. Now I should say that this activity tracker is kind of based on a step counter, so more or less you could think of it as steps, but we never used the kind of the notion or concept of steps in the game. You can also see comments in here, so this is kind of a scrollable canvas, just like any kind of activity feed on a social network. There you see the passes and things like that. But if you look at another team's activity, you can't see their comments. You only comment with your own teammates. And we also have a league view where you can see kind of current standing. There's also an indication in this one where you see the ball next to the team name that indicates whether or not the ball is being active right now. And that can be important if you're playing against someone and you want to overtake them. Because if they are not active, that means that they are not going to get any score at that point, but you might be if you are being active. So what was pass the ball? Because we wanted to kind of figure that out. So we did a trial. We asked people to play the game for 2 weeks, and after the 2 weeks, we interviewed them and asked them about, what was their experience. We had 31 participants. We had 21 females and 10 males. They composed 7 teams. Now we wanted to have kind of, before the game was most pleasurable to play with an existing social group, so we recruited people who were friends using kind of snowballing techniques. So 6 of these teams are people who know each other, but we also had a team of strangers who didn't know each other before. And the team sizes varied between 7 players and 2 players. And the teams with the fewest members actually stopped playing the game after a while, but the 4 top teams here played the game throughout the whole thing. So what was happening here? Now, we have a lot of kind of findings in the paper, and I don't have time to talk about all of them, and I want to highlight just a few of them before I go into talking about some lessons learned from this and then conclude with some general implications. So people were kind of passing the ball in the beginning kind of in an uninformed way, kind of just to try it out, see what happens, but also kind of to invite people into the game. So if they were in a team and then someone just joined, then they could have you pass the ball to say, hello, welcome, I'm pleased with playing with you. But as it kind of developed, as they kind of played this game throughout these 2 weeks, it started to become more of an organized strategy. And this becomes an organized strategy based on them kind of starting to learn people's routines. Because they start talking about, oh yeah, I'm going to go out running now, I'm going into work, pass me the ball. Or saying, oh yeah, I'm going to go to the shop at 5 o'clock, pass me the ball so I can get some points for that activity. So they kind of had this kind of thing where they booked the ball for the future time, but also in the immediate time. And by doing that, they kind of learned routines of others. We also saw things about how they kind of made sense of activity. So the kind of activities that they were tracking was kind of just things that you would normally think about that an activity tracker would track, such as walking, running, and cycling. But they also talked about other things, just like general stuff that they did, like pottering, shopping, housework. And one team were developing these stretching exercises that gave them score in the game. And one participant kind of said this thing about every time there is motion, we try to utilize that motion to score. And it kind of expresses that they just experimented with this, like how can they score points in this game. But they also didn't just kind of make sense of their own kind of relationship between scoring and their activities, but also looked at what other people were doing. So the people who were doing stretching, for instance, thought that they were doing well until they looked at someone else and so why are they getting thousands of points? Maybe we should be doing something different. So I just want to quickly run through some lessons learned here before I go to the general implications. Players were accepting of the turn-taking constraint to activity tracking and communicated with each other. So even though this game was kind of constrained and it's kind of the way they could track their activity was a very constrained thing, we did manage to make something that was playable for the majority of people and enjoyable. And I think this is kind of evidence that there is still room for kind of experimentation in this space. The app tracker highlighted and supported routine behavior than it did non-routine behavior. So like I said, kind of routine became this kind of primary resource for coordination in the game, and that was great for people who did have a routine. But when people didn't have the same routine life, like students, for instance, playing in a team with working professionals, they kind of felt a little bit more excluded because of that. Players sought practical ways to manage identity and privacy when using the app. So we saw a couple of different ways in which this kind of played in, how this kind of, there were some tensions in that, and there's more about that in the paper. Players oriented to experience collaboration and competition in different ways. For instance, they had different relationship to the competition part, where some people were really into that and kind of looked at the league table maybe 30 times a day, whereas other people did not care at all. But since the game kind of played together, even those who weren't interested in competition kind of had to become interested in it anyway because people were talking about it. And so the practices by which players made sense of activity tracking evolved during play. So we get to see here kind of how people started making sense of what activity was. And the way they did it kind of developed as they played this thing, how they kind of get score for themselves, but also how they did it together with others. Finally, competence and sense-making in activity tracking concerns the whole device and not just the app. They're not just looking at, what activities are giving me certain points, but also how they're handling the device, how they're carrying it in their pockets, also what device they have in relationship to, or as compared to other players. So kind of to conclude here, I want to end with two things. And that is what you can think about when you're designing kind of activity trackers for yourselves. And one is you should attend to people's practices of tracking. So what we have seen here with Pass the Ball is that we have got people to kind of talk about how they're kind of making sense, how they develop a way of making sense of their own data, but also of other people's data when it comes to tracking and what they do when they track. And so what we see here is that this data is not a mirror of activity, but it's merely a medium for understanding the activity. And finally, when you look at kind of activity trackers, they typically use either collaborative tracking or competitive tracking. But we feel like social relatedness seems to encompass much more than just competition and collaboration. And we've seen in previous work that we've done as well on people using activity trackers, how there's more to social use of tracking than there is in just collaborate or compete against the quantified activity, if you will. And so with that, I'll pass the ball over to some questions.
Chris Elston, Culture Lab at Newcastle University. I just wonder if you could say anything a bit about how conflict was resolved. So if two people wanted the ball at the same time, or if people were excluded from the app because they weren't walking very much or they weren't doing much activity. Did you see anything like that in the trial?
So we saw, for instance, how some people were kind of enabled and motivated by how the ball was passed, and some people felt like, yeah, good, I can not just use this activity for activity, but I can do this for actually scoring and that sort of thing. But we also saw people kind of having conflicts with, if you're all the time going out and saying, yeah, pass me the ball because I'm going to go out and score, you're kind of bragging and saying, yeah, I'm so good and just getting points. But at the same time, if you don't do that, if you kind of inactive, if you don't have the routines, you can say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go out running, in 5 minutes or at 5 o'clock. Are you kind of being passive? Are you seen as a bad person then? So we saw a little bit of that. And like I said, there's a lot more findings in the papers, and we can talk afterwards as well.
Nitesh Goel, Cornell, really cool talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this process of sense-making and reflection, self-reflection about it. So there's this whole turn-taking happening, which is sort of real-time in some ways, but did people reflect about their own activity tracking as well, and how did this turn-taking go around themselves, or with them embedded in this turn-taking as well?
That's kind of one of the things that we really look at here is in kind of, or that we unpack in how they try to make sense and talk about and relate to not just, the data that they collect through the tracking, but also in the ways how they choose the different activities, but also how other people choose these different activities. So what was the question?
It's more around the self-reflection about it after it had happened, after everything's happened, after the ball's been passed around. Did they
Well,
ever go back to it?
Well, I mean, I think it's mostly in kind of in the ways they develop. I mean, they relate to what they did before and how many points they got, or what the score they get, what they were doing, how they're handling the device, and then they compare that to previous activities, but also the current activities.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.